Welcome to our class. This week we will look at functions. I would first like to talk about the ModelViewController software architecture, commonly referred to as MVC. What this is an architectural design in order to keep the presentation of data separate from the programs that interact with the data. You will recall this concept of separation of data from presentation in the HTML document where the style sheets are separate from the content. So we want to separate the data from the actual programs that work with the interactions. By this approach, the front-end developer and the back-end developer can both work on the same system without interfering with each other. The model is responsible for managing the data, for storing and retrieving it. Usually this data is stored in a database. The view, which is the presentation, displays the data. It is responsible for formatting it and presenting it to the user as an HTML web page. The controller works between the two of them, enabling them to work together. So the controller will receive a request from the client, and that request can be as simple as executing PHP code when the page loads. It invokes the model, which is the data. Requests are made, operations are performed, and the data is sent to the view for display on the web page. So here we have a design where we see the client request. The controller doesn't necessarily have to request data, but it can. Returns it back, sends it to the web page. The controller works with the view, formatting, and the request goes back to the client. Let's take a look at functions. A function is a block of statements that can be reused. The main reason for creating a function is to reuse that code. A function will not execute immediately when the page loads. The function needs to be called, so there is a call to that function somewhere in the code. A function can have parameters, so you can pass information to it using arguments. Functions can also call or return a value by using the return statement. There are some rules for creating function names. They must begin with a letter or underscore. They may contain letters, numbers, and underscores also. The names of functions are not case sensitive. The names of variables are case sensitive. So this is something that you need to be aware of in PHP. It may differ for other languages. You create a function using the function statement and then the name of the function. The name of the function will have a left-hand and right-hand parenthesis next to it. If parameters are passed, they will go inside those parentheses. If not, the parentheses will be empty. The code to be executed when that function is called will be placed inside the left-hand and right-hand curly braces. The function is called when its name is read, and then the code inside the curly braces will execute. Here is an example of creating a function with a parameter. The parameter is essentially a variable or placeholder. It will assume a value that is passed to it from an argument. So somewhere in that code to be executed, you will also have that parameter in at least one position. So let's take a look at the call for this function. We have two calls to this function below. Write message to, we are passing it the value of Teresa. Teresa is an argument which is being passed to the function. The parameter, which is in the definition of the function, is a variable placeholder that accepts the value of the parameter. So $name now stores the value of Teresa. It passes it down to the placeholder $name, which also now has the value of Teresa. Therefore, when the function is executed, it will say hello world Teresa. The same function is executed next with an argument having the value of Jose. So the value of this argument is passed to the function. Now that parameter has that value, and it passes it down to this placeholder $name. When the function is executed, it will display hello world Jose. A function can also return a value, and in order to do that, we need the return statement. In the code, the function is called, as always, with its name and if there are any parameters. Generally, when it returns a value, you are probably passing at least one argument to it. So here we see a function where we are summing up two numbers. So when we create or define this function called sum, we have two parameters, two variables. Notice they are comma separated. In the code inside the curly braces, we have an expression. That expression is going to be the sum of the values passed to the function. It is stored in the variable $z, and the return statement will return the value of that variable. In the function call sum 5, 10, we have two arguments. The first argument is passed to the first parameter. The second argument is passed to the second parameter. So here the 5 is passed to $x, the 10 is passed to $y, $x is 5, $y is 10, 5 plus 10 is 15. The function will return a value of 15. So we are looking at arguments that are being passed to the function. Arguments can be passed by value or reference. Value is the default, meaning the value that we pass to the parameter, we are essentially passing a copy of that value. The original value does not change, as that could have come from another source. When you pass an argument by reference, essentially we are creating a pointer to that value, so that the value passed to the function, if it changes inside the function, will be changed in the original place. So let's take a look at how this works. The default, an argument is passed by value. Here we have a function called add5 with one parameter. And what we're going to do, we're going to use the plus equal operator and add 5 to that value. Our value is coming from a variable, original number, and it is 10. When the function add5 is called, and we pass it the value of that variable, which is 10, if we were to echo back the original value, we would see that it is indeed still 10. To pass an argument by reference, you need to tell PHP you are doing that. And how you do that is to place an ampersand in front of the parameter, as we see here. This is the same scenario with the original variable being set to have a value of 10. It is a different function called add6. We are now adding 6 to the number that is passed. However, because we added 6 to that number, the original value is now 16 because it was passed by reference, not by value. You can also create a function with a default parameter. So therefore, if the user did not send an argument, there is a default parameter already in place with a built-in value. So let's take a look at how this works. Here we have a function called say hello, and inside the parentheses I have one parameter set to a value. So this is how you set a parameter with a default value. And here is my echo statement that will be executed when the function is called. So in the first function call, say hello, I am passing it a value of Teresa. In this case, I am sending this argument to the parameter, and the value will be Teresa, so the statement will say hello to you, Teresa. In the second function call, I am not passing an argument. Therefore, this function will use the default parameter, the value being set to student, and it will say hello to you, student. You can also create a function with a variable parameter list. This would come in very handy to allow you to possibly pass multiple values, depending on how many you'd like to pass. For example, a calculator, if you wanted to add several numbers. So here we have this function called add, and that's exactly what we're doing. In order to use a variable parameter list, you need to use the PHP built-in function underscore get args. And what that is doing, that is essentially storing how many arguments you have passed to the function as an array, storing it in this variable. I'm also starting out by initializing the total to 0. Because this is an array, we can use the for each loop and loop through, and every time we go through the loop, we're going to add one of those arguments passed as a parameter to the total. And in this case, this function will return the total. So here is the function call where we are passing 3 parameters. We could pass 2, we could pass 10. It doesn't matter because we can dynamically obtain the number of arguments, store them in an array, loop through them, and work with them. This is an example of a user-defined function, very useful for working with form data. We have been working with forms, and one thing that we looked at when working with forms was trimming empty spaces from the right or left. And yes, that requires the trim function. There is another function, strip slashes, which is valuable because users sometimes put them into the form elements. And we've also looked at the HTML special chars function, which converts potentially malicious code into character entities. So these are 3 functions that you would use before you were to retrieve the value of a form element. And it would be very cumbersome to use each one separately. So what we have done, we have created a function called checkValue. It takes one parameter. And what we're doing, we are essentially executing these 3 other functions inside. We are first trimming the value, then we are stripping the slashes, then we are executing the HTML special chars function, and we are returning the value that now is the value that we want, which will be used later on in the program. So if you look at the bottom of this slide here, where this function is called, we have the check value, and the value it's checking is coming from our form element, $_post_fname, because the usual procedure is to retrieve that value and store it in a variable. So before we store that value in the variable, we will first trim it, strip slashes, and execute HTML special chars all at once by essentially using the check value function. Variable scope. Scope refers to the visibility of the variables. In PHP, we have two kinds of variables, global and local. A global variable is declared outside of the function. A local variable is declared inside the function. In most programming languages, local variables are only accessible or visible within that function, and that is true in PHP. However, in most other programming languages, global variables are accessible everywhere. That is not the case with PHP. A function in PHP does not have access to global variables. Therefore, should we wish to have access to them inside a function, we need to use either the global statement or the global's built-in array. So let's take a look at how we would do this. In the first example, I have a function, get_b. On top of that function, I have a global variable set. It is global because it is outside the function. So if I wanted to use the value of $b inside this function, I would need to make it global. And I can do this with the global statement as we see here. In the second example, it is the same function using the same global variable declared outside that function. And in order to have access to that variable inside the function, here you see how I am using the globals array. So either one of these procedures would allow us to access the global variable. In PHP, we also have function scope. All functions in PHP are global, even if they're defined inside other functions, which means that we can access a function regardless of where it is. However, once you define a function, it cannot be defined again in another place. That is a good rule of thumb to have unique names not only for functions, but also for variables. You will see developers using a set prefix in function names to avoid name conflicts, if those functions might be used elsewhere. So if you were essentially creating a group of functions that were pertinent to a certain application, such as a shopping cart, you might prefix them all with the same prefix. Okay, creating a library of functions. Most developers use functions over and over again. And it is a good idea to start organizing functions that you might be using over and over again. This allows for a more rapid development of your application. There are two main statements in PHP that allow us to do this. One is the include statement and one is the require statement. There is also an include once and require once, which are almost the same as the above. What the include and require statements do, they will allow us to insert text, PHP code, HTML code, a combination of all of it, from an outside file and place it inside the file where that include or require statement is. Include and require both do that. There is no difference. Including files is very common and very useful when you want to include the same code that might exist on every HTML web page, regardless of whether it's PHP code or HTML code. Similar to an external style sheet, you will see that it is very useful for things like navigation. If you work with a WordPress application, you will see that their headers, footers, and other components are all called using includes. So what is the difference between the include and require statement? The include will continue to execute the code underneath it even if the file is found. So if there was a problem with the path or the file not loading, the rest of the code will still execute. The require will not. The require essentially will throw an error if that file is not found, and it will stop code execution at that point. The include once and require once execute the same as the above. However, if the file is already there, it will not add it again. So here is one situation where you might see an include inside an HTML element where we might be placing a menu. And here we see PHP, the include statement followed by the file name. If there is a folder path, that needs to be included. Here is another example of where you might see an include in a PHP code, possibly at the top of the document, where we have some other code to be executed. You might first see the include to include a file. This is commonly used with databases where we need to open a connection to the database, and once we have the code that opens that connection, there's no reason to copy and paste it on every page. Simply store it in a file and include it using an include. We will look at that in the weeks to come.